Alright, so our next step here is to go through and flatten all of our frames. Now the only reason this is really important on this project is because we still have some joinery to cut into these. On the tall dresser, on the top and middle frame, we have to go through and cut a sliding dovetail to support that center cabinet panel. That's going to have some drawer slides screwed into it and is going to have be the inside of the right hand cabinet. On the wide dresser, we have a whole bunch of little dividers that are going to go up the whole length of this thing to break it up into a bunch of different drawers here and there because we just want as many drawers as possible. And so I'm going to try flattening these on my drum sander. Now, unlike the side panels, these are going to be flat all the way across. So we do have the problem here of we are going to have some areas where this whole thing may become unsupported. So I'm just going to be very careful as I pass it through. I do have the extension tables on my 1632 drum sander, so we should be supported for most of the way. But I'm going to watch it obviously on some of these ones, some of the lesser important ones. So the bottom frames on the tall dresser aren't going to get any joinery cut into them. So those are the ones I'm going to start with. That way, if they do get a little bit messed up, it's easier to fix without it affecting the overall fit and finish of everything else. Alright, so now that I have all the frames flattened, we can move on to adding the sliding dovetailing. So I'm going to be using my Lay D4R Pro to do this. So this is a top-of-the-line dovetail jig. I'll talk more about it when we get to doing the drawers and that, but for now I'm just going to use it to cut the sliding dovetail. Now this is one of those features of this jig that I really wanted, because the only other way to really cut a good accurate sliding dovetail is to make a jig of your own, which can sometimes be at a square, whereas this I know is everything here is precision milled to be perfectly square, and I have micro adjustments and all that here to very easily square things up. So this is one of the features of this jig that I really am looking forward to. Okay, so I have the female portion of the sliding dovetail cut on our tall dresser top and middle panel. Now, I decided to just start with this dresser because I want to make sure that the bit depth on my router when I go to cut this actual panel is the exact same as it was when I cut these. That'll make my life a lot easier going into it. And all I have to do when I'm milling my panel is I just have to make sure that it fits between this opening and the sliding dovetail on the bottom. As long as it fits between there, when I go to cut my sliding dovetail, it'll fit in perfectly in this middle section here. Now, the one consideration I have to make when I'm sizing this panel is that this middle section here may be wider than it needs to be, or it might be narrower, either way. So what I have to do is I have to make sure that this opening in the middle here is the exact same as it is on the edges here. Now we're pretty close, we're within about a 64th of an inch in the middle here, so all I'll do is I'll just put a clamp to just slightly bring this middle section down so that we actually match exactly what we have on the ends. That way when we put in our panel, it's not going to force a bow into any of our pieces, it's actually going to pull everything together a little bit better. Now I didn't show any footage of dry assembling this dresser because I had a lot of trouble with it. It was late at night, I was not thinking clearly, I should have just kind of walked away from this project a little bit sooner, but I didn't. So putting this thing together was a little bit annoying, and I've made a really bad discovery. This panel that I put it on the side here has completely cupped, so we have about a 1/4 inch gap away from our stretcher pieces of these frames. Now, given everything I know about woodworking and wood movement and joinery and everything I've learned in the past few years of woodworking, this was the dumbest idea I've ever had, thinking I could just put a long grain panel into a slot like this and that it would just stay there just fine. Now the reason I did this was purely for looks. I wasn't thinking about proper joinery or wood movement or any of that stuff. I just wanted this panel on this side to visually match the panel that's going to be in the middle here. And obviously it can't work like that because this panel is going to cup if I put it in like this. Now luckily I didn't go in and glue this panel. I think there might have even been a little bit of foreshadowing when I was talking about not gluing in this panel. Because what we're going to do is we're just going to take this panel out, I'm going to set it aside in my shop, and I'm not going to use it on this project. So it is a little bit of a waste of materials, but what we're going to do instead is we're going to make the exact same panel over again, But instead of just putting it in the way we have now, we're going to just make it a breadboard end panel. So we're just going to put a piece across the top, piece across the bottom, and that will totally prevent this cupping. Because the issue here, the reason that this cupped, is because we don't have anything preventing this panel from wanting to move and cup. And wood is always going to cup one way or another. And so I really do have two options in here. I can either do a breadboard end panel, which is what I'm going to do, or I could do a frame and panel. Now the only reason I don't want to go with the frame and panel is just because I think it'll look a little bit weird in this area here. All right, so we've got that middle panel in there now, and it fits up beautifully. Now there is one minor issue here. During when I was cutting with the router, I did break out this piece of white oak in the front here because luckily enough, when I was not paying attention doing the glue up on these panels, I have a little bit of a knot down at the bottom here, so with that little bit of curly grain, we just broke out a small chunk. Now it's a very easy fix. I have enough width on this panel to just cut off the front edge here. But the minor issue that I also caused when I was gluing this up is that these white oak pieces that are going to be on all the fronts of these panels, I milled them to exactly 1 5/8 width, so that they matched our stretchers and our legs. Now, realistically, I shouldn't have done this. I should have left them at like 1 3/4 or even 1 7/8, a decent amount of extra material, knowing that when I cut the sliding dovetail with the router, that I might get some tear out. Now, I thought I'd be able to prevent it, but obviously I was not. So if you're doing this for yourself, just make sure that if you have parts that you want to match up, just make sure you leave a little bit of extra width. So because it's always easier to take material off afterwards, because right now I can't go back in and add that extra, 1/16 of an inch that I need to this piece of white oak. So all that that's going to mean is that on our inside here, we do have a little bit of a mismatch of a line. It's maybe a 32nd of an inch. It's nothing big, nothing really serious. And it's a minor annoyance that I could fix if I had just given myself a little bit of extra material on here. But other than that, everything else on here is good to go. And so I'm going to set this dresser aside for a little bit just because I have everything set up for the dovetailing jig to cut these sliding dovetails. I'm going to start working on the wide dresser and getting all that sorted out too. Because the reason I'm just doing these one at a time is because I didn't want to, overwhelm myself. Doing this one panel took me about 3 hours just because I've never done sliding dovetails successfully before, and this is my first time using that lead jig. Everything about this was a massive learning curve, but it all worked out just fine in the end. We've got a really well-fitting panel. There's no slop in this once you actually install it in here. I made sure that the male part of the dovetail was just loose enough that I could still slide everything together. Because what I really want to avoid is when I'm going to do the glue up, I want to make sure that I don't have to pound these things together. Because a sliding dovetail joint, although it's a very strong joint and very reliable, in this circumstance it's going to keep things from pulling apart, it is still a fairly fragile joint because you're taking away a lot of the supporting grain around that dovetail on that end grain connection there. And so there is a fairly good chance that if you tweak it or twist it really badly, you can break that tail fairly easily. Now, one thing that is worth mentioning is that when I was fitting up this panel, you saw that I started by using my miter gauge and my little Incra sled that I have. Now, this works really nicely to give a perfectly square edge because I can make very fine adjustments to my miter gauge to make sure that I square up to the blade nearly perfectly. Now, the miter gauge that I have, I've mentioned this a lot before, not a good miter gauge, but with a little bit of time and effort put into it, I can get it perfectly square. So by squaring up that one edge, I can then, when I'm doing my very fine adjustment fits, I can then use the fence on my table saw. Now, the one thing I will say is that anytime you're cross-cutting using the fence on your table saw, you need to be extremely careful. And you don't want to do it with extremely narrow pieces. So if your piece is anything shorter than, I'd say, 12 inches, that's a no-go. You don't want to be cross-cutting like that. You want to always use a miter gauge. Because of the width of this panel, it was fairly stable against the fence there, and I could guide it nice and safely. And so the main reason for using the fence rather than the miter gauge in that circumstance is when you're trying to take fine adjustments using a miter gauge in a sled or just a normal crosscut sled, you're doing everything by hand. You're making rough estimates, rough guesses, and you're just trying to nibble away at that material. And that can be very hard to stay accurate when you're walking back and forth from the table saw to the workpiece, back to the table saw to take off a little bit of material. Whereas when you use the fence, you can just tap it a couple times and take off basically 280th of an inch. I don't know what that actual measurement would be, but you can take off such micro amounts that you can really dial in the fit. So that's the benefit of using the fence over the miter gauge. Now again, you have to be very careful of what you're doing there. You need to make sure that you are confident in the way that you're holding your piece, in the way that everything is being pushed through that blade, so you're not going to get kicked back or anything nasty like that. Alright, so we've hit a small snag on adding in the female portion of the sliding dovetails to the frames on the wide dresser, and that is transferring the marks over. So when I cut the one side, I have the marks to line up to, everything is super accurate, that's great. But the problem is when I go to cut the other side is I don't have any more marks to line up to because I've just got a big gap right in the middle here. And so what I tried to do on one of the frames is transfer the point down, make a mark on my setup block that I've got in the jig, and use that to align it. Now the trick there is that I'm trying to move this whole frame back and forth and try to align that perfectly. And that is nearly impossible to do because trying to make those micro adjustments on this whole frame is very hard. Now all I'm going to do is just bring down a line from each of the points of the widest part of the sliding dovetail here. Then when I mount this frame into the jig, I can use the micro adjustment features of the actual fingered assembly of itself to move that back and forth and really get that perfect adjustment. Now, more than anything, this has just kind of highlighted a major design flaw in what I've done here. And so if we look back at the 3D model, you can see that we've got these three drawers on the bottom here. They're each broken up by a frame going in between, and we have a sliding dovetail panel that connects each of those. Now, this is the complete opposite wrong way to do this. The proper way to have done this would have been to put one solid panel that has a sliding dovetail connecting to the bottom frame and this middle frame where we have a transition between the 2 drawers and the 3 drawer sections. Now the reason this would be better is because sliding dovetails are a very complex thing to add in. And so as you guys saw when we did the tall dresser here, that took a lot of time, a lot of setup, there's a lot of, just finickiness that you have to deal with in order to line those things properly. And so the way that I'm going to be doing it now is I now have to do that 6 times. Whereas if I just did one frame in here, I only have to do it twice. So there's a much higher chance of me screwing up here compared to if I just did one single panel in the bottom here. The other trick is that would also be a lot stronger. Having one solid panel right in the middle here that would tie both your middle frame here and your bottom frame together, and then mounting everything off of that would be a little bit stronger than what I'm doing here where I'm breaking up those panels. So if you've never worked with sliding dovetails before, if you're kind of in the position that I'm in now, the much easier option would just be to do a solid panel right down here, put a sliding dovetail at the top, sliding dovetail at the bottom, and then if you want these other stretchers in here, you could just tie them into that main panel, or you could just leave those stretchers out. In fact, one of the things I'm doing on the tall dresser here is I plan to put a bunch of stretchers in the middle here in these areas. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to fill those mortise holes and fill these little holes on the front here as best I can to make sure that they're as invisible as possible. And I'm just going to not put anything in there because there's no point filling this space with those frames. Now I'm really hoping that my plan for aligning these sliding dovetails on the opposite side that we haven't cut yet, I'm hoping that that works out on the lead jig. It should work out. You know, it's a pretty precise jig. Luckily, you can make very fine-tuned adjustments. So that's going to be, you know, kind of the saving grace of this whole project. So more than anything, the money that I spent on that jig, if it doesn't already save my butt for making all the drawers on this thing, it's saving my butt right now with making all these sliding dovetails, because I honestly don't know if I'd have been able to do any of this without that very expensive jig. Okay, so we've got the top two dividers in and everything is coming together really well. So we're getting really close to the point where we can glue up this wide dresser. We just have to do a few more kind of housekeeping tips of just going through, cleaning up the inside of these frames, adding that chamfer in here so we were losing all these sharp edges, just going through and double checking the fit on all of these frames, making sure that everything is going to go together nicely when we do the actual glue up. And so one thing that's worth mentioning here is that the design of this is not that great. So I've never built an actual dresser like this before, let alone something that is this wide. So when I went into the design of it, I thought that I would be able to build enough resistance in that bottom frame to really bring enough support across here. Now what I'm finding is that my bottom frame is not stable enough. As you can see with all our supports in, if I push on the top, you can see the whole thing will flex. And it flexes a decent amount. So if we start loading this up with drawers and clothing and that, it's going to pull everything down. Now the reason that this is happening is purely because my bottom frame is just not built tough enough. Those bottom front and back stretchers should both be in the vertical orientation like we have the front one, and they should both be about 3 inches thick minimum. The way I have it now, it's about 2 inches over most of its length, going down to about 1.5 inches in the middle. So that is definitely not a strong enough, and again, we should have those vertically oriented stretchers on both the front and the back. The other part of this that would help strengthen a long dresser like this, where you're trying to not have supports in the middle, would be putting vertical stretchers on the top frame as well. And all I'm going to do is just add in 2 little feet kind of hidden underneath our panels here. And so it's going to be pretty simple. I'm just going to take some of these leftover pieces of 8-quarter white oak, mill them up nice and square, and then we're just going to attach them with some screws to this bottom of this frame here. And so you can see here just why these feet are so necessary, because both of the feet that I just made are a perfect fit under both ends of this dresser. Whereas in the middle here, you can see that we're about 1/8 of an inch too tall. So what that means is that this whole middle section of the dresser is sagging about 1/8 of an inch. And so once we install these feet to the bottom of this stretcher here, that'll create a nice solid support that'll put this at the exact same height as the rest of the dresser here.